Most mornings begin so quietly that they hardly seem worth remembering. The porch boards still hold the coolness of the night. A faint breeze stirs the leaves at the edge of the yard. Somewhere beyond the fence, a mourning dove calls once, then falls silent. You unlock the front door the way you always do, coffee still warming your hands, expecting nothing more than another ordinary sunrise. But this morning, before your eyes ever reach the driveway or the street beyond, something small catches your attention near the welcome mat. It doesn't belong there. A single object rests in the pale morning light, no larger than the palm of your hand. Not trash carried by the wind. Not something a neighbor would have dropped. It sits too deliberately, almost as though someone had placed it there with quiet intention before the world woke up. You stop without realizing you've stopped. For a few seconds, the only sound is the rustle of oak leaves overhead and the distant hum of a passing truck somewhere beyond the neighborhood. Then you feel it. That strange hesitation people rarely talk about. The moment when your instincts notice something before your thoughts can catch up. And as your eyes slowly lift from the object, you see it. A crow perched on the mailbox just 20 feet away, perfectly still, watching, not calling, not searching for food, simply watching. It doesn't flinch when you look back. It doesn't seem frightened by your presence. Instead, the morning itself feels as though it has paused between two breaths. If you're new here, consider subscribing before you leave, because the stories we explore together may quietly change the way you look at the birds that share your everyday world. And this is where the ordinary begins to slip into something far more difficult to explain. Because the object at your doorstep was unusual enough. But what happened next made it impossible to believe it had arrived there by accident. You may have never spoken about a moment like this out loud. Most people do not. They glance at something unusual, feel a quiet pull they cannot explain, and then almost immediately begin talking themselves out of it. It was probably the wind. Maybe another animal carried it there. Someone must have dropped it yesterday and you simply never noticed. The mind is remarkably good at restoring ordinary explanations, even when something deeper continues to whisper beneath them. Yet, there is another part of you that does not work that way. It notices before it analyzes. It feels before it names. You have probably experienced it in places far removed from birds, walking into a room that suddenly feels different for reasons you cannot describe. Waking in the middle of the night with the strange certainty that something has changed. Looking at an old photograph and feeling an emotion arrive before a single memory follows. Those moments rarely announce themselves with noise. They arrive quietly, almost politely, asking only for a few seconds of your attention. That is why so many people dismiss them. They are too subtle to compete with the constant rhythm of everyday life. Standing on your porch, the crow still watching from its silent perch, you may have felt exactly that. Not fear, not excitement. Just an unusual awareness that this morning refused to settle into the familiar pattern of every other morning before it. Something about the stillness seemed to carry its own weight. The object remained exactly where it was. The crow remained exactly where it was. And the longer neither one moved, the more difficult it became to ignore the quiet feeling that this moment had begun long before you opened the front door. But that is only where the story begins. Because the more researchers have learned about crows over the past few decades, the more remarkable this silent encounter starts to become. What most people never realize is that an encounter like this rarely begins on the morning they notice it. For a crow, recognition is almost never instant. It is something earned through repetition. Long before you paused at your front door, long before that small object appeared on the porch, the bird may have already known far more about your daily rhythm than you ever imagined. Researchers studying American crows have observed that these birds distinguish individual human faces, remember them for years, and quietly adjust their behavior based on countless previous encounters. But memory is only part of the story. A crow watches patterns. It notices which houses wake before sunrise, which driveways remain quiet on weekends, which people walk slowly, which ones stop to look up instead of rushing past. Day after day, those tiny observations become something surprisingly detailed. To you, stepping outside with a cup of coffee feels like an ordinary habit. To the crow resting high in the branches across the street, it becomes part of a predictable map of the neighborhood. That is what makes the morning feel different now. You are no longer looking at a random visitor passing overhead. You may be looking at a bird that has quietly included you in its understanding of the world. There is something profoundly humbling about that thought. Not because it proves anything mysterious, but because it reminds us how often another living creature may be paying attention while we believe no one is watching. The crow still had not made a sound. It simply remained where it was, calm enough to let the silence speak for itself. And once you begin seeing the encounter through that quiet layer of recognition, instead of coincidence, another question naturally begins to form. If the bird had been observing for so long, why did it choose this particular morning to leave something behind at all? There is one detail about crows that continues to surprise even the scientists who study them. They do not simply survive in the human world, they learn it. Studies from the University of Washington have shown that crows can recognize individual human faces and remember those faces for years, passing important information to other crows through social learning. But perhaps even more remarkable is what happens after trust begins to form. Wild crows have occasionally been observed leaving small objects near people who regularly feed them or behave predictably around them. Tiny buttons, bits of polished metal, smooth stones, bottle caps that catch the morning light. Researchers believe these objects are not gifts in the human sense. They may be expressions of curiosity, reciprocal behavior, or simple social exchange. Yet knowing the science does not make the experience feel less extraordinary. Somehow, it does the opposite. It reminds you that another intelligent mind noticed your presence often enough to change its own behavior. Standing there on the porch, you realize the object beneath your feet may have traveled through beaks, branches, rooftops, and quiet morning flights before arriving exactly where it now rests. That journey alone makes it meaningful. Whether the crow intended a message is something science cannot answer. It measures behavior, not significance. But people have always lived in the space between those two things. Between what can be observed and what can only be felt. The crow remained motionless, the first rays of sunlight catching the blue sheen hidden inside its black feathers. It looked less like a visitor now and more like a patient witness waiting for something only you could decide. And that is where this quiet encounter begins to move beyond behavior alone. Because the strangest part was not the object itself. It was what started happening after you chose not to walk away. You did not rush to pick the object up. Somehow that felt important. Instead, you stood there for another few quiet moments, letting the morning unfold around you. A squirrel crossed the fence without urgency. The breeze shifted across the porch railing. Somewhere farther down the street, a garage door opened, and life continued as though nothing unusual had happened. Yet when you finally looked back toward the mailbox, the crow was still there, not frozen, simply present. It tilted its head ever so slightly, the movement so small it almost disappeared into the stillness. Then, without a sound, it lifted into the air. Its wings pushed only a few slow beats before it glided toward the tallest oak at the end of the block, disappearing behind the leaves as though it had never been there at all. The next morning, you found yourself opening the front door a little earlier. Not because you expected anything, at least that is what you told yourself, but your eyes drifted toward the same patch of weathered wood before they looked anywhere else. Nothing waited there. On the third morning, the crow returned. This time there was no object, only the quiet silhouette on the same mailbox, catching the soft gold light just after sunrise. It watched for less than a minute before flying away. Days passed, and the pattern repeated often enough that it became impossible to dismiss completely, yet never often enough to become predictable. That uncertainty was what slowly changed everything. Without realizing it, you had begun looking up into the trees instead of down at your phone. You noticed the sound of wings before the first cup of coffee. You recognized the familiar shape crossing the pale morning sky. Whether the crow had changed or whether you had changed was difficult to say. Sometimes the deepest connections begin so quietly that you only recognize them after they have already become part of your everyday life. And once that quiet awareness settles in, something even more surprising begins to happen. You stop asking what the crow is doing, and you begin asking why your own instincts refuse to forget that very first morning. After a while, you stopped measuring the mornings by the calendar and started measuring them by small details that most people would never notice. Whether the oak leaves moved before the sun reached the porch, whether the neighborhood sparrows scattered a few seconds before the familiar dark shape appeared overhead, whether the mailbox stood empty or occupied by that quiet observer who never seemed to arrive in a hurry. None of these moments proved anything on their own. Yet together they formed a rhythm that was difficult to ignore. Human beings are remarkably sensitive to patterns. Long before language, long before written history, our survival depended on noticing subtle changes in the world around us. A branch bent where it usually stood straight, an unfamiliar silence in the woods, a flock of birds lifting into the sky all at once. Our ancestors trusted those feelings because they often arrived before understanding did. Perhaps that instinct has never truly disappeared. It simply grows quieter beneath the noise of modern life. Standing on your porch each morning, you begin to wonder whether the crow has changed your routine or simply uncovered something that was already there. You notice yourself slowing down, listening longer, watching the spaces between events instead of the events themselves. Even the object you carefully placed on a nearby shelf no longer feels like the center of the story. It has become a reminder that attention itself can transform an ordinary morning into something unforgettable. Many people believe moments like these carry a message. Others believe they reveal nothing more than the extraordinary intelligence of a remarkable bird. Perhaps both ideas can exist together without canceling each other out. Because the deeper mystery has never been whether the crow intended to tell you something. The deeper mystery is why one quiet encounter continued echoing through your thoughts long after it was over. And it is only when you begin looking beyond your own front door that the story takes its most unexpected turn. When people speak about crows across generations and across cultures, they often speak with remarkable caution, not certainty, not fear, just respect. Many people believe a crow arrives at meaningful moments because it notices changes long before people do. Others see nothing more than an exceptionally intelligent bird responding to the patterns of the world around it. Perhaps those two ideas are not as far apart as they first appear. Intelligence has a way of looking mysterious when we do not fully understand it. And mystery has a way of feeling deeply personal when it arrives during an ordinary morning that somehow refuses to remain ordinary. As the days continued, you no longer waited for another object to appear. That expectation quietly faded. Instead, you found yourself paying attention to something much smaller. The sound of wings crossing above the roofline. A familiar silhouette resting for a few silent moments before sunrise. The way the neighborhood seemed to pause whenever the crow settled into the same high branch overlooking your yard. Nothing dramatic happened. No impossible signs. No voice from beyond reason. Only a growing awareness that some encounters ask us to become more observant rather than more certain. Something about that feels difficult to ignore. Perhaps the greatest gift the crow left behind was never something you could hold in your hands. Perhaps it was the invitation to notice the world with a little more patience than before. To trust that not every meaningful experience arrives with an explanation attached to it. Some simply arrive, remain quietly beside you for a while, and then continue living inside your memory long after the moment itself has passed. Whether spiritual or scientific, something had shifted within you. The porch had not changed. The oak tree had not changed. The crow may not have changed either. Yet the way you looked at all of them never returned to what it had been before. And that quiet change would make the final morning unlike any of the ones that came before it. One morning, the porch was empty. No small object resting in the light. No familiar shape waiting on the mailbox. Only the pale glow of dawn stretching across the wooden boards and the quiet scent of damp earth after a cool night. For a long moment, nothing moved except the leaves high above your head. Strangely, disappointment never arrived. Instead, there was gratitude. Not because you expected another encounter, but because somewhere along the way, you had stopped measuring the experience by whether the crow appeared at all. The real change had happened much closer to home. You had begun listening again. You noticed the wind before opening the door. You noticed the shifting shadows beneath the oak. You noticed how every morning carries its own silence, and how that silence is never exactly the same twice. The small object remained where you had placed it on the shelf inside your home. Occasionally, sunlight would catch its surface as you walked past, and for just an instant you would remember that first quiet morning without needing to explain it. It had become less like evidence and more like a bookmark in your own life, marking the place where you started paying attention to ordinary things with uncommon care. Perhaps that is how meaningful moments stay with us. They slowly stop asking to be understood and simply become part of the way we see the world. Many people spend years searching for extraordinary experiences, never realizing that the deepest ones often arrive wrapped in familiar routines, asking only that we slow down enough to notice them. The porch was still the same porch. The street remained unchanged. Yet standing there in the soft morning light, it felt as though the world had quietly grown larger than it had been before. And just when it seemed the story had settled into that peaceful stillness, one final detail appeared that would gently reshape everything you thought the encounter had meant. The following morning, as the first light spread gently across the porch once again, there was still nothing waiting at your door. The mailbox stood empty. The oak branches swayed softly against a pale blue sky. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called only once before the neighborhood settled back into silence. And somehow, that single sound was enough. You smiled without expecting anything more. Because by then you understood something that had taken days to unfold. The object had never been the center of the story. Even the crow, remarkable as it was, had never truly been the destination. What remained was something quieter, something that could not be placed on a shelf or measured by science alone. It was the realization that the natural world has been speaking in small, patient ways all along, and that perhaps our busiest moments are the only reason we fail to notice. Many people believe birds sometimes carry messages. Others believe they simply reveal parts of ourselves we have forgotten to trust. Whether spiritual or scientific, perhaps both lead us toward the same place. A slower heartbeat, a longer glance toward the trees, a willingness to let wonder exist without demanding certainty. The little object stayed where it was, not as proof of anything extraordinary, but as a reminder that one quiet morning had changed the way you looked at every ordinary one that followed. Thank you for staying until the very end and sharing this quiet journey with me. If stories like this leave you seeing the world just a little differently, consider subscribing before you leave, because there are still so many quiet mysteries waiting just beyond the edge of everyday life, and perhaps we will discover them together. Until next time, keep looking a little longer at the branches outside your window, listen to the silences between familiar sounds, and trust the moments that gently ask for your attention without demanding your belief. Maybe it was only a crow, but somehow it never felt like only a crow. And somewhere out there tonight, beneath another old oak tree or beside another quiet front porch, something small, feathered, and wonderfully ordinary may already be watching the next story begin.